Hey, all right. It's so nice to see you.
Is I can't believe it's been a while, but it's nice to catch up and thanks
Yes,
so much for doing this.
I know. Me too. Me too. All right. For people joining, my name is Janet Sermon, and I am a private photography dealer in Los Angeles. And with me is Edward Yee, who is an appraiser, and he's been with the firm Penelope Dixon and Associates since 1996 and president since 2019. The firm focuses only on documentary and fine art photography. In addition, in addition to his role as an appraiser, Edward has served on the board of the Appraisers Association of America since 2013 and is currently serving as their board president, which is great. So, Edward, I'm so glad to be talking with you today, and I know that collectors and anyone who owns photographs really wants to learn from you today. So, in this conversation, we're going to be talking about photography appraisals and best practices for people to be able to protect their investments.
So,
Um, and just to set the stage, last month in January 2025, Los Angeles experienced a series of really devastating wildfires. Um, Sadly, 29 people lost their lives, and more than 16,000 homes and other structures were either damaged or completely destroyed by these two fires that were in the Los Angeles area. Um, and I have one client that I know of, there might be more, who tragically lost their home and everything in it, including their photography collection. Um, and he was not prepared. He really was not prepared. And any documentation that he had was destroyed in the home as well, so it was really a tragic loss. So that is one of the things that brought us here together today and why I wanted to talk to you. And so to start off, I want to start off with two things, and two questions. You can either answer them one at a time, or you can kind of answer them together, which is talk about why are appraisals important, especially when some type of disaster strikes, like these fires, and what do you do as an appraiser?
absolutely. So, I'm gonna actually answer your second question first. So really the objective of an appraiser is to establish value. And, it's always kind of interesting because, the need for appraisals, having had the career that I've had, it's interesting seeing globally how the need and demand for appraisals has changed. So appraisers really are objective third parties that come in and make an assessment. We have to consider, what's happening in the retail market, what's happening in the auction market, and today, what's happening even I'm going to somewhat separate this out because it exists as both, the online market, which, and so, where, and the different outlets where these go in terms of determining value. What's the most appropriate market, to evaluate a piece? What are the appropriate considerations? And, I'll get into this, I think, a little bit later too, in terms of, some of the criteria that as an appraiser, you need to follow in order to be able to kind of make that judgment. But in the simplest definition of what is an appraiser and what is an appraisal, is it's a professionally informed opinion of value. And so, a lot of times appraisals, for example, they're often done for legal reasons. frequently. That is why. And when I say legal, I mean legal and tax. I mean, those are really that's it. Otherwise, a lot of times, for example, when people will, they want to sell, for example, and let's say they don't have necessarily a very high valued item, they want to send, and they come seeking to get an appraisal. It's our job to say, listen, appraisals, they cost money. You can go to X dealer or X auction, Y auction house, and they'll give you an estimate of what they think that they can do for it. But unless it's a really high value piece, particularly if you're looking on a one-to-one basis, it doesn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense. Whereas for insurance, it obviously makes sense
Mhm.
for donations or estates, the requirements. But it's also kind of interesting looking, if you look at the international audience, in Europe, it used to be you'd say, well, an appraisal, it's why do I need an appraisal? It's worth whatever I can get for it. And so it is something that has changed a lot, and it changed a lot in the last several years. I think that
For what reason? Why did it change?
I think that number one, the growth of the market in general, in the last decade in terms of, art being collected as an asset class, that has definitely helped to spur the need for them, obviously for insurance purposes, but, setting a trust, a variety of things, part of the great wealth transfer. There were a lot of reasons, I think, why it's ultimately, people need to have these numbers on paper and, know that that they are well done. Your first question, which was the, sorry, what was the first question?
Well, why appraisals are important.
Okay, yeah, I mean, so that is kind of they are kind of tied into that, in terms of being able to have a basis, for example, and the reality is that when you're dealing with value, particularly for, vintage material or material that's particularly rare, you might ask three different people and get three different opinions,
For, for
And
sure.
so, one of the challenges, as an appraiser is knowing who are the right people to talk to, because again, we often have to talk to galleries and dealers as well because, for example, we only appraise, but there are appraisers, for example, that also do sell. They are in the market,
Right.
and there are actually very specific rules that regard that factor that in as well that have to be followed.
Right.
But we pride ourselves, on not we don't broker, we stay out of that entirely. We're literally market observers and make those determinations. So it's important really for documentation purposes and legal reasons.
For sure, for sure. And so you mentioned a couple of different kinds of value.
Mhm.
Can you talk a little bit more about the differences between, say, a retail value, a fair market value, an
Absolutely.
insurance value, and even a donation value? Um,
Absolutely.
yes.
So there is a multi-page list out there of all the different types of value. But the ones that are most commonly used are fair market value and retail replacement value. By far and away, those are the two different ones.
And
There are
how do those differ? Like what
I,
you're
I'll
going to
get
tell me?
so as an example, and actually I'm going to issue a talk about a third one, auction value. Because I think that's not that we make the determination for auction value often, but we have to factor it in. And the way that's simple to do this is that basically retail replacement value is the highest price that can be justified to replace a similar property of similar age and similar quality. So you're normally going to be going to look at the retail market for that. The fair market value must consider, well, what's happening in the retail market, what's happening in the auction market, and which of those two are the most appropriate for the piece that you're evaluating.
Uh-huh.
So, as an example, the in a fair market value appraisal, let's take something that compare and contrast two different things. There might be, for example, a vintage, a gallery or dealer that represents a specific estate.
Hmm.
And that's it. There really are, they have a print that is on offer. It has not appeared at auction, even though the artist might have an auction record. The reality is you'd say, okay, well, retail market for this specific piece is actually going to be more weighted towards the retail side in determining the fair market value. Now, the difference might be, let's say that the retail price is $10,000.
Hmm.
The retail replacement value there would be $10,000. That is, you cannot assume a discount, for example, or other things. And in actuality, when you're doing retail replacement value, even though you're evaluating the piece, when you're making the conclusion on the appraisal, you can allow for things like sales tax and framing costs and shipping and things like that, that just kind of is a separate aggregate item, because those are
Right.
things that need to be covered.
But
Um,
those add up.
they add up. They
Yeah.
add up very quickly.
Yeah.
Um, in determining fair market value, for example, those are items that cannot be considered. So, for example, like when we do donation appraisals and fair market value, if people have really expensive frames, they actually have to get the frames appraised separately from the photographs. These are IRS rules. But going back to the whole issue of value, let's say, for example, it's a piece that regularly appears at auction. Dealer has same print at, again, I'll use this $10,000 price,
Hmm.
but it regularly sells at auction for 5,000.
Right. Right.
So the reality is you'd say, okay, well, if the retail is 10, maybe they close the sale at 9,
Right.
and you've got the 5,000 auction, fair market value would probably be something in the neighborhood of around 7. You've considered all of those different variables.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so the one of the things that when you're working with an appraiser is to determine what, or work with them to say, okay, well, what is the definition of value that you're trying to conclude? So, in some cases, you have to know cash value, or you need to know what is the auction value. Like in divorces, for example, divorces generally will use fair market value.
Mhm.
But again, art, like all art, it's an illiquid asset. And so, for example, like depending on what the circumstances of a particular case are, it might be, okay, in a divorce case, for example, okay, this has to be liquidated within 6 months.
Mhm. Mhm.
What is the value, which is going to be more of a distressed value. Um, you know,
Right.
because you've got those kinds of variables that start coming in. So
Right.
it's really important, and as it pertains to insurance, it's actually really important because while the general convention is that insurance is done at retail replacement value, it's really important for collectors to check with their broker and have them check with the underwriter. What is the definition of value that my policy is written on? I
Mhm.
can tell you that even in my own policy, I had to ask my broker, and it took them 6 weeks to get the answer back. And because the broker wasn't capable of answering. And I have seen cases where the insurance has been done at retail value, and what ends up happening is that the policy is at fair market value, and the insurance company has questioned it, and it's gone to litigation.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Um,
Because there can be, I mean, depending on the piece and also the number of pieces, that it could be a large discrepancy between those two.
well, exactly. And there's an interesting case we had been contacted about years ago. We actually didn't do it because there wasn't really anything we could do in this particular case. We actually would have agreed with the insurance company. But it was a case where somebody had bought, the artist happened to do very large additions to like 1,000 of their prints, and
Mm.
had very commercial retail spaces. And as the prices start very, very reasonably, but as the edition sells out, what ends up happening is that, they get into the high six figures,
Wow.
as
Wow.
these images start to sell out.
Hmm.
And you're talking about things that start out at low four digits. Now, granted, that's what the retail gallery is saying. But imagine as you're, you know, this type of art with that size and addition, there's a vibrant secondary market that's available. You can readily get those pictures for, low to mid five figures. Um,
Right.
and actually, in this case, this collector had acquired dozens of these works. And the appraiser that they had hired had only done the diligence of checking with the retail gallery and went with the retail gallery prices, went with full retail replacement value. And when a claim had to be made,
Mhm.
the insurance company did their diligence at that point, and they contested it because they knew enough to know that there was a secondary market. In actuality, when we get approached to do those appraisals, we say to clients right off the bat, you know, because it's incumbent upon. I mean, not every appraiser does it, but I think a good appraiser does, is just, you take on a kind of a general cursory view if you don't necessarily know what the market for that particular artist is, particularly in someone like this case, because it's not, it's not Cartier-Bresson, it's a contemporary living photographer.
Right.
But, you can try and understand some of the variables that come into play, and it's important to communicate that, I believe, to your client. Listen,
Yeah.
I know we know that this gallery is going to say XYZ, but we're not going to be basing the value on that because it's just not defensible, and and in the end, that's what is important is, the defense of an appraisal.
Right. Because if someone needed to make a claim, I mean, I kind of imagine that, the first response of an insurance would kind of be no, or they're going to want to, make sure if they're going to need to pay out that it's justified. And so they'll do their due diligence. So it's much better to have your appraiser have your collection, have the due diligence be done up front so you know
Absolutely.
exactly what's
Well,
happening. Yeah.
sadly, another sad fire story is when the Sonoma fires had broken out. And
Mhm.
there were certainly cases that we would get calls, for things that were lost. And one in particular was really, it was an artist, and they lost all they had. The negatives, they didn't have a lot of prints. That negatives, transparencies, contact sheets, but it was all lost.
Oh,
And there was nothing we could do. We had nothing that we would base on. It's not like you say, oh, okay, I've got, this Kudalka, then you can say, okay, well, what was the rough size? Even anything to make some assumptions are, because in an appraisal, there are certain rules, there are certain concepts rather, that an appraiser has to address. And one, for example, is a hypothetical condition. And so a hypothetical condition is that we are establishing the value based on something we know not to be true for this particular object. So that way we have a baseline. So a case in point, this print has been water damaged. Well, we've been asked to determine a value if it wasn't water damaged.
uh-huh, uh-huh.
Okay. And
Right,
then, so that would be the hypothetical condition in that appraisal.
right.
And then, there are other, and that becomes, I think one of the big challenges, particularly depending on whether or not you're dealing with vintage or contemporary photography, for example, it becomes, it can become an issue because, with contemporary photography in particular, kind of expect it to be mint. And if it's not, what's going to happen? And I mean, there are cases, these don't necessarily always come up, but you hear about them. I say come up as appraisal assignments, but you might not necessarily hear about them. For example, there was one recently that I heard about where the print was flush mounted, and it had
Oh.
become separate. And in this particular case, the artist, I can't remember which way this went, but the point is they were no longer, I can't remember if the original print had a border or if it didn't have a border, but the point is the artist wasn't doing that practice anymore. So this print essentially becomes an orphan print from the edition. And that has but for better or for worse, that can have, particularly for a resaleability standpoint.
Exactly.
So, and a lot of times, in those kinds of cases where you have that happen or those kinds of things happen, that's why it's really important to kind of have the value in the ground as of a certain point and say, okay, this is where it was, what I have, this has happened. Having that documentation, I think, is really, is helpful for collectors.
Oh yeah. Oh yes. Um, well, so one question I had is, you take all of these factors, the in terms of value, how long is an appraisal valid? Like once you do it, how long
So
is it
there
good for?
is it being a legal document.
Hmm.
Appraisal always has an effective date. It is technically valid on that date and that date only. And the reason being, yeah, it's because again, something tragic happens tomorrow. I issue an appraisal today. Something tragically happens tomorrow and there's a stock market crash or whatever it is. Value
Hmm.
tomorrow will be different.
Right.
So it's as of that date. Now, typically what happens is, we get these calls all the time, and so textbook, it is whatever the effective day of the appraisal is, that is the value on that day.
Hmm.
We get calls from clients all the time, should we, is it time to, do an update? Like, should we do an update?
Right. Right.
My, like, listen, I am like, I'm a collector myself, like, you don't need to be constantly be having major, appraisal bills all the time. I get it.
Right.
But the reality is that it's when there are major shifts in the market, or, after a few years, like,
Mhm.
usually it really, because again, the artist might pass and maybe there's a bump in the market,
Right. Exactly.
whether or not, so it's important to be able to try and understand these things, in terms of, each case is a little bit unique. But the worst case scenario, you call up the appraiser and say, what do you think? Is it time? Is it not time? What's kind of interesting is that in the flow of time, in the ebb and flow of time, there are certain time periods where in our firm, insurance appraisals tend to make up a higher percentage of work that we do versus other work that we do.
Hmm. Hmm.
And the what I have observed in my career is that certainly when there are, um, uh, you know, there's a certain period of time, like some people, it used to be every 2 years, people would do it. Then
Hmm.
that kind of like people got a little, didn't do it as frequently, went to 5 years. Fine. When there are major shifts in the market, everyone wants to know. Like in the last 2 years, the percentage of number of insurance appraisals have absolutely increased. Now, I attribute that to two reasons. Number one, quite frankly, the insurance companies are on a lot of these collectors to make sure that their insurance appraisals are up to date because of, frankly, just the risks. Collection protection is a big thing right now.
Hmm.
And,
Yes.
the insurance companies are very much looking at it. So it's coming from that. And then there's been a shift in the market, and so looking at how that shift is, playing out, people don't want to be overinsured, they don't want to be underinsured. You want to be insured within a reasonable amount. I think that, practically speaking, I think that the most important thing is, having the insurance appraisal, so that way that the documentation is there, there's something on file.
Right.
We had a client maybe, let's say about 6, 7 years ago. And I don't even know, I don't think we even had done an appraisal on, they had lost some photographs in a fire.
Mm,
But the sorry, not lost, damaged.
mm,
But we had they got water damage from the firemen, when they were putting out the fire. And
right.
they did have, so we at least had something on which to work. But of course, just because they had not been insured, at least there was something to work with. Or there might be a case, for example, like, okay, it's been lost, but we have something to work with it. Just because the insurance appraisal had not been updated in a couple of years, the insurance company's still going to ask, okay, well, what was the value on the date of the loss?
And
So
I mean, what happens as you tell this story? And I'm kind of thinking of people watching and wondering, and they are saying, well, I had an appraisal done 5, 10 years ago, but I know there has been a shift in the market. Say, oh, I have a photograph, it was valued at 5,000, and I saw a recent auction and now it's like worth 30,000. Um, if something happened, say they didn't update their appraisal,
on
but
that
they,
side, it'd be a problem, because again, they're going to be underinsured.
oh, I see. I see. So it's not even, it's insured. The insurance would just cover
Up to whatever the policy limit
up
was.
to what the policy limit was. What if we're talking about more than one photograph, you know, uh, somebody has 10, 20, 50 photographs, they had an appraisal done. Um,
It depends. Yeah, I think I know where you're going with this, whether or not because some policies do have like they're $500,000 policy, but any single item that it's a blanket policy, but no item above $20,000 or $50,000, even though it's the whole policy might be for 500,000. Like that's an important thing to talk to with your broker.
okay. Okay. Right. Yes.
What is the limit, for any single loss, not just catastrophic loss.
That's an excellent question because I don't think that's something that people would even think about. So,
Yeah, I mean, you think
yeah,
you're covered, and yeah, I think that is very much the case.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, so that I mean that actually leads into my next question, which, because you have so much experience as an appraiser and, working in terms of insurance, what is, one question, or it's okay if it's more than one question that you feel like every collector should ask their insurance company?
So, I don't think you should be afraid to ask questions, and I think it's always important to remember that the objective of insurance is to make you whole. That is the primary objective, and it's to make you whole on the day of your loss. Because I have seen cases on either end, where it's you know there are two sides to every single coin, and so but really the objective is to get to the right place, and it is about asking questions. For example, what is the definition of value that the insurance company will accept in the event of a loss? Key, first and foremost.
Yes, number
If
one.
it says fair market value in there, in the policy, then it's fair market value. If it says retail value, great. Chances are, if it does say retail, I'm going to assume, I don't know this for sure, but it would stand to reason that if you're doing your policy on a retail replacement value, definition is going to be more expensive. The premium will be higher than fair
Mhm.
market value. That is,
Right.
I would assume. I think that you know, other questions I think would be, well, what is the claims process?
Excellent.
How,
Right.
what is the claims process, and how long does it typically take for it to get resolved?
Right. Right.
They may not have an answer, but it's always, I'd be surprised if the broker had an answer. But it's a fair question. They might.
Right. I mean, there
Certainly
might
from the
be,
process, the process side, they may not on time. I think that's the issue. Because I've seen claims take a long time depending on what the circumstances are.
right. There might be. many steps or things that you may need to be prepared to provide.
Correct. So when I was dealing with my collection, I asked them this question about fair market value, because my policy is written to fair market value. And I said, well, I'm playing a little bit of devil's advocate here. I more or less describe the exact same scenario here where I have several works where the gallery is the primary, um, the primary rep for it, and that is the retail. Will they accept that, or are they going to put, more onus on whatever the auction record, which is not really developed? And it took 6 weeks to get the answer, and they were like, retail value is fine, but the onus is on you. That was so I said, okay, fine, no problem. And that goes to actually one of my really important points. So if you don't have an appraisal, like you haven't gotten one, you're waiting, whatever the reason is, documentation, documentation of the photographs that you've got on the wall. It's so easy these days. Get it on the cloud.
Yes.
Get it secured on the cloud. What do I need to know to be able to establish the value, for something? Well, you know who the photographer is. Need to know what the image is.
Mm-hmm.
If you're taking a picture, for example, and it's framed, um, don't do them straight on. Take it a little bit out of, or you can take it straight on one, but try not to get the glare.
Mm-hmm.
An
Mm-hmm.
angle is fine. Take multiple pictures. It's fine. It does not hurt. Um, I need to know what's on the back. I need to know what the signature information is.
Right. Right.
So need to know image size and print date.
Yes. Yeah.
If there's any ambiguity as to the medium, having that, and that's where, and invoices, copies of invoices, very, very important. Um,
Right. Right.
these are all things that can be easily digitized and secured. And it's not, it's for any natural disaster, really. Runs the gambit. I think it's incredibly important.
Right. Absolutely. So have you, okay, actually, let me ask this question. What do you think that someone should look for when they're hiring an appraiser?
So first and foremost, they should be USPAP compliant. So USPAP is an acronym that stands for the Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice.
Mhm.
First question I'd ask any appraiser. Basically, it is a set of guidelines that are congressionally approved that they stemmed out of the savings and loan crisis of 1986. Um, and they are the standards by which any good appraiser, and they basically they deal with the whole issue of, okay, I'm a dealer and I'm also a appraiser. When do I have my dealer's hat on? When do I have my appraiser's hat on?
Mhm.
What are my reporting requirements? What is the due diligence? What are the ethics? So as an example, an ethical issue, which will sound completely, it should be abundantly obvious. When an appraiser takes on an assignment, you do not base your fee. No appraiser should be basing their fee on a percentage of the value of the collection. Completely inappropriate.
Yes. Yes.
Um, you know, appraisers usually either bill by the hour or by the project, which usually has a time component to it. So that's first and foremost. Secondly, you want to make sure, and this gets somewhat dealt with by USPAP, because there's a rule in USPAP referred to as the competency rule. You want to make sure that your appraiser is competent in the area that they are appraising. So the issue becomes, so for example, like I serve on the board of the Appraisers Association of America. There are three primary appraisal associations in the U.S. The Appraisers Association of America, which deals predominantly with personal property as opposed to real property, like land.
Mhm.
There's the American Society of Appraisers and the International Society of Appraisers.
Oh.
Now, they all, like a personal property appraiser, which is what we are. Might be a member of all the organizations, but for example, like ASA tends to have more real estate appraisers are members of that organization. Or, business appraisers might be more an ISA or a combination of ISA and ASA. But in the end, each of the different organizations have areas of specialization.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, in the Appraisal Association, there are two levels. You can be or three actually, you can be a member, an accredited member, and a
Hmm.
certified member. So
Oh.
certified members reach the highest level of standard. And those would be, for example, in our organization, they're denoted by three A's at the end of their signature line to know that they're certified.
And
So
and so how do appraisers like how do you become certified?
So you go through an application process. So to become accredited, you have to submit appraisal. Like I'm not sure how it works with ASA and ISA, but so I'll comment on the Appraisal Association. You would submit appraisals to become accredited, and those appraisals will be done at donation, estate, and insurance. And so you need to be able to opine on values, explain them, etc. And you'll either be accepted as an accredited member or not.
Mm.
If you want to go through certification, you have to take a certification exam. And that certification exam I'll put it this way, I took it, when I took it, I was like, well, how long do you think the exam will be? I'm like, a few hours. You're like, no, when people come to take this exam, it's all day. People, like you have all day to take it, and most people do. I was writing for that exam. I got there at 9. I didn't leave there until like 5:15. I think I had like 15 minutes worth of lunch. Like it was, they're
Wow.
expensive.
Wow.
But they're covering a wide base of knowledge. And then
Mhm.
obviously that gets reviewed. You either pass or you fail. If you don't pass, I think it's like a couple of years or a year and a half or something like that before you can retake it. There's a
It's like passing the bar for lawyers.
Yeah, yeah.
Wow. Wow.
And those exams will be graded by other certified members. So in that particular specialty. So for example, like in photography, there aren't a whole lot of us, when someone does a certification exam, that will get circulated among the different certified photography appraisers.
Right. Wow.
And actually it's also not only, and that's important because it's also a IRS rule. For example, like let's say I was doing Saul Lighter, Saul Lighter who did both photographs and paintings. I can't do the paintings. I'm
Mm.
not qualified. I'm not certified in paintings.
Uh-huh. Wow.
So it's medium specific.
Interesting. Interesting. Um, I actually had another question. If we could just do like a minute sidebar and just talk about appraisals for donation purposes just for a minute because
Sure.
I know I have a lot of collectors ask me because they're thinking about donations. So, I mean, my understanding if somebody wants to get an appraisal because they are interested in donating, um the donation value I mean that has its own definition and it's
It's fair
usually
market value. It's required. It's fair. So fair market value. Willing buyer, willing seller, both knowledgeable of the facts and neither under a compulsion to buy or sell.
I see. Okay. And then if they donate it, well, I guess that's an IRS issue because then they are able to take the deduction, but then that's like a percentage of the
Yeah,
fair market
that's an
value.
accounting issue. The key things though, and the key things from the donor's standpoint, taxation notwithstanding, here are the key takeaways. The gift must be made on or before the 31st of December of the tax year in which the deduction is to be applied.
Okay. Okay.
The When a gift is made, the deed of gift, which is the legal transfer, must be completed on or before 31 December of that tax year.
Okay.
It is not considered legal until both parties sign. So, for example, I give an institution a print on November 10th.
Mm-hmm.
They send me the form. I sign it on December 5th.
Mm-hmm.
They get it back to me on countersigned that it was accepted on
Mm-hmm.
December 18th.
Okay.
The effective date of valuation is December 18th. It's the last of the 2 days.
I see.
Now, this is a really important point because this is the kind of detail that will get donations thrown out. Do that exact same scenario.
Mm-hmm.
The last signature happens on January 5th of the following year. It counts in the following year tax year
That year. Okay.
because it is the last of the two signatures.
Right.
Other important things to be aware of is that read the deeds very carefully because the deeds, any restriction potentially on a gift has to be reflected in the value. Now, what does that mean by a restriction in the gift? Um, you know, I give, I donate, I donate 25% of this photograph. You can have it for 25% of the year, or like thankfully I've never had to deal with any of these, but there are apparently very complicated ways that people do some gifts. They're not outright gifts.
Right.
Just be careful. I mean, like I'd have to talk to somebody if we ever got approached about doing one of those. We've never
Mm-hmm.
had to. Thankfully, they're all, those are all, you know, important things. But for example, like someone makes a gift and it can't be displayed. That would be a good example of a restriction.
Okay. All right. I
You know,
know sometimes you go to a museum and you see it says promised gift. So
yeah, and promise gifts are fine. They just haven't been finalized. And they
uh,
won't be finalized until the legal transfer actually happens over.
okay. Okay.
So,
Wow.
yeah.
Good to know. Good to know. So, have you ever been tasked to appraise work after a disaster, right? And they never I'm still thinking of my client who lost everything in the fire, including the documentation. I mean, is there anything that can be done, or have you ever been tasked to go in after there is a loss?
Yeah. During Sandy, there was certainly some cases there. Um, the damage appraisals are really, really almost a subspecialty. It's in many cases the reason why they can be they it's not necessarily. I'm going to use a case study here that I can talk about because it was in the state Supreme Court of New York,
Okay.
and it was not a disaster scenario, but it was a damage and loss. And this was a case where it was a Avedon canvas mural of the Chicago Center.
Oh, wow.
At the time, Gagosian was retailing them, I think, for 2.3 million. And basically, one of the three panels was uh, one of the three panels was damaged due to a pipe break. The insurance company they spent a lot of money on trying to get this print restored. Can't be replaced, can't be, and the foundation had they'd had an appraisal on it. And the value on it was essentially a total loss, effectively. But there was a value ascribed that wasn't very it was a nominal value. The insurance company had reached out and asked us to opine, like what we thought of that value. And, kind of looked at it and said, well, the reality is that $2.3 million is a lot. It has been restored. Is it perfect? No, it's not perfect. by any means, but there is probably a value that is more than that nominal value. And because of that difference, it ultimately did get litigated. And as it was about to go to the state Supreme Court, one that this goes back to about, the whole thing about appraising is that, you know, we we had come up with a rational and a defense as to why we thought that the value was actually X and not this nominal value.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I remember when I was in the deposition, they were like, well, why do you think your value is right and the other one isn't right? And I said, well, I don't. So that's for the court to decide. I said, but I can tell you, I've given my rationale as to how I came up with this value. They can either agree or disagree with it. They're like, great, we're done. It actually settled out of court. It never actually went any further. The insurance company ultimately did, I think did settle and it was all fine. But I mention it because of the stress that comes with damage appraisals. Because those are definitely, even in the Sandy case, when it's like it depends a lot on the particular circumstances of the piece. The rarer the piece, the more and the larger volume. Like in the case of that Sonoma fire, everything was lost. There was nothing to go off of. In comparison to the one where there with the fire, where the prints were essentially water damage. There was at least something to go off of. And
Right.
so each case, no damage appraisal is easy. But it is helpful to have a starting point to know where was it before it was damaged.
Yes.
And, like at least you have a stake in the ground there. But those are all, the variables that go into it, the rarity is absolutely a huge, a huge part of it. And it's further complicated, I'm speaking relative to photography, but the reality is that obviously there are a lot of collections that go beyond that. Photography as a medium of multiples, by its very nature, it's a little bit different. At the exact same time, you know, you got to look at the particular circumstances
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
on a
So
case by case basis.
ex-
Probably not the best answer, but
exactly. Exactly. Wow. Wow. So if someone wanted to, decided, wow, I really think I should probably get my collection appraised now, because I know collectors, they don't even have, well, either inadequate insurance is usually the situation that they're in, because it can be expensive. Um, but if someone came to you, reached out to you for an appraisal, like mm, how when you consult with them, like what can they expect? Like, do you offer, you know, consultations and what should they be able to expect or how can they prepare if they were going to give you a call?
yeah. So I mean, the first thing is that I think this is absolutely fair to say because it is an expense and it's not inexpensive. The reality is that depending on what your needs are, you have to think about top top to bottom. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. Like you can
Right.
appraise a portion of your collection. But we all have the things that we love our collections.
Yes.
I mean, but I have some things that I love them. Were they the best investment? Have they? Like, do I need to necessarily get them appraised? No, but I love them. Like I wouldn't
Yeah.
necessarily spend the money to have it appraised. But I listen. So I think that certainly there's the whole soup to nuts. But look at your collection and say, okay, this is like there was somebody had just recently sent me a list of things for an insurance appraisal, and they asked the question, like, can you omit some things, if there's anything that you think is just of lesser value? Well, that becomes a little bit tricky because one person's lesser versus a not.
Right.
But the
Right.
reality was there were of the 70 items that were on that list, there were five that were like under $1,000. There's just no, I feel very comfortable with that.
Right.
There are
right,
others like I just wouldn't know until like either A, I saw it, or B, you get into it. And those ones, just I believe in being a straight shooter,
hmm
like
hmm
so it's about having a dialogue. It's being able to say, okay, well, what do you need? Like is it a matter of saying, well, I don't want to spend any more than this. What can I get done, within this? This is my collection.
right,
But I need
right.
to know what you've got. The biggest thing that, it impacts the cost of an appraisal is the number of artists. It takes a lot longer to appraise a collection of 100 works by 100 different artists than
hmm
100 works by one artist, because you got to look at each market.
For sure, for
And
sure.
so, that's important to know. And there's things that you can do, like if you've got good catalog, or you know, you know, we can do it all. But the reality is, you can probably find someone cheaper to, do some cataloging, get the basics there, so we're not starting from scratch.
Right,
Um, you know,
exactly.
you can
And
do it
that's
yourself.
part of, I see that also as a collector. I mean, we're all like stewards of this work, you know. We have it and we live with it and we love it for a period of time, but hopefully there'll be a time when we either sell it or give it to family or donate it or whatever. But I think part of being a good steward of the work is to get into the habit of when you buy a new piece, make sure that you document what you have, you know? In I think galleries, dealers can be a part of this too. When you send the invoice, send digital images of the front and the back, you know, so that people can then take that information, organize it, make sure that it's in the cloud. You know, don't have it be pieces of paper in a drawer that can get lost or destroyed, anything like that, right?
So here are a couple of tips for people going forward. Because for example, like so we see a variety of invoices. We love it when the invoices are super detailed. Like i.e. they've got the signature information or like great, it's all there. Unrealistic to assume that that is going to happen universally. It's not. But a lot of times I love it when framers or collectors do this, is that whenever there is anything on the back, they
Hmm
take a picture or photocopy and have it on the back of the frame
Right.
and have a copy in a binder. I mean, like, make it accessible.
Yes.
And that way we know exactly what's there. We know what the signature looks like. Because the type of signature can also have an impact on the value. Is it a
Yes.
late signature? Is it an early signature?
Yeah.
Like these are things that all matter.
Yeah.
And we want the appraisal to be as accurate as humanly possible. And a lot of those variables, it's least common denominator, in terms of, you know, when things are not well documented, it's really the onus is to prove why it is not the least common denominator. That's not, that is on the collector.
Right. So kind of what you're saying is that if you're forced to make an assumption, you're gonna have to be conservative,
Absolutely.
right?
Yeah,
Without the documentation. So that's a
correct.
big reason why a collector should document. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That's very good and very practical, actionable advice for people. So I really appreciate that. Um, I think that this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for your time. And I also, can you tell people how they can get in touch with you?
So easiest is email. So my email is ed
Mhm.
at Penelope, Penelope, then the letter D as in David.com.
Okay, perfect. And
So
I will put this in the recording in the show notes. I'll make sure that that's there as well. So,
absolutely. And
Yeah.
Jan, thank you so much for putting this together. I think that, listen, information is key. Being preemptive is key.
Yes.
I lived in Florida for a long time, and even if it's two things that I should comment on. Number one, if people want to do their own cataloging, for example,
Hmm.
and they don't even know where to start, call, email. I'll send you an Excel, that there's a basic template for you to get started. Because I think that a lot of times when people go to catalog, they don't, if you're going to take the effort to do it, might as well do it right. And when I say doing it right, it's about categorizing the information, making it easily accessible to not, for everyone, and so
Right.
Excel's a great way to do it. Everyone generally has it. Happy to do that. That's an easy thing. And don't be afraid to ask questions. Pick up, you can email, give you my phone number, call, like set a time to talk. Questions, deserve answers. And if we don't know, it's okay not to know everything either. We
Right.
can find the answers.
Right.
Try to find the
Exactly.
answers, but gotta put it out there. So
Wonderful. That's very generous and sound a wonderful resource because also people buy from different galleries, different dealers, and they, as you mentioned before, the invoices are not uniform. There's always different things. So for an Excel spreadsheet, that's fantastic because people can just, artist name, title, signature, mounted, unmounted, all of those different things.
it's just, and today, looking back over the last 30 years, it costs nothing. It just costs time.
Oh, exactly.
Like we have all the equipment at our fingertips as a function of everyday life. And, I was going to say, even as a stopgap measure, it's worthwhile walking through your house, just slowly, just taking a video
Yes.
of your household contents, for like just having that visual documentation. That's why I would do. So I thought when I lived, anytime a hurricane came or the cone came, that's what I would do. Take a little walk and stroll around the house. Who knows? Maybe I didn't. Maybe there's something I missed. I at least had it.
Exactly.
You know.
Exactly. That's so true because a lot of people have collections and maybe it's not quite enough to buy a complete separate art insurance, but there's, their home insurance, um, and it's covered under that, and you want to make sure that things are included. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, as far as insurance go, one last comment I'll just make, because I think it's something that, as an appraiser, you do have to, I have to deal with it less so, maybe general content appraisers have to deal with this a little bit more. But it speaks more to, I think, major natural disasters, is that sadly, insurance just will not account for, sentimental loss. Like that is just, that's what makes it hard. And I think, I mean, one little thing that I know that I do personally is, like if I have something that has sentimental value to me, I take a picture of it on my phone, upload it to the cloud. At least it gives me something. It might not have much value, but at least it gives me some connection to it, because I think that there is an emotional component. There's no denying it, whether it be collections, they're your things, they're your history. And I think that,
Exactly.
that's what this tragedy has reminded us all. They are things that, hopefully can be replaced, but they are also emotional things. So
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. That's such a good point. Wow. Wow. Thank you so much. I do want
my
to be
pleasure.
respectful of your time, but this has been such a great conversation and so much information. I know everyone will just really appreciates all of your insights and your stories, and it's really valuable advice, It's really fantastic. So,
Well, thank you so much. It really was it was a pleasure. And yeah,
yeah.
I'm sure
Yeah.
I'll see you soon.
I hope so too. I
All
hope so.
right.
Okay.
Bye.
Right, take care. Bye.
You too.